You spent your 20s becoming someone. Your 30s building something. And then 40 hit and asked the question you weren't prepared for: was any of it actually yours? The ambitions, the goals, the version of success you chased, were they chosen or inherited? 40 doesn't just mark time passing. It marks the moment when you start questioning whether the life you built is the life you actually want. And that question changes everything. Welcome to Unfiltered Adulthood, where we explore the quiet psychological shifts that reshape you in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. If this resonates, subscribe and hit like. He wakes up on his 40th birthday and the number sits heavier than he expected. Not because he feels old, but because he feels stuck. Stuck in a life that looks successful from the outside but feels hollow from the inside. The career he worked toward for 20 years. The house he bought. The routine he maintains. All of it suddenly feels like someone else's blueprint. And he can't shake the question: when did I stop deciding and start following? She looks around at what she's built and realizes she can recite the reasons she made every choice, but she can't remember if any of them were truly hers. The degree she pursued because it seemed practical. The job she took because it paid well. The relationship milestones she hit because that's what people do at certain ages. And now, at 40, she's standing in a life that makes sense on paper but doesn't resonate in her chest. This is what hitting 40 often does. It disrupts the narrative you've been telling yourself. The story that said if you work hard, make responsible choices, and follow the path, you'll end up somewhere good. And you did end up somewhere. You have things to show for the years. But 40 asks a different question than 30 did. 30 asked, are you on track? 40 asks, is this the right track at all? He thinks about his 20s and how everything felt possible. How he'd stay up late talking about dreams and plans and all the things he'd do once he figured it out. But figuring it out meant making choices. And those choices narrowed the field. Each decision closing a door. Each commitment eliminating an option. And now he's 40 and the doors are mostly closed and the options mostly eliminated, and he's wondering if he closed the right ones. The crisis of 40 isn't about aging. It's about authenticity. It's the sudden, uncomfortable awareness that you might have been living someone else's version of a good life. Your parents' values. Your culture's expectations. Your younger self's assumptions about what success looks like. And all of that got baked into decisions you made years ago, back when you didn't know enough to question whether those definitions fit who you actually are. She remembers being told that stability matters. That security is the goal. That you build a career and find a partner and buy property and raise kids if you want them and check the boxes that add up to a life well lived. And she did those things. Or most of them. But 40 showed up and asked a question nobody prepared her for: do you even want this? Not in theory. Not because it's what you're supposed to want. But actually, genuinely, want it. And that question is terrifying because answering it honestly might mean admitting that the last decade was spent building towards something that doesn't fulfill you. That the goals you chased were borrowed. That the identity you constructed was more about meeting external standards than expressing internal truth. And if that's the case, then what? Do you keep going because you're already this far in? Or do you dismantle what you built and start over? He looks at his friends who seem content. Who aren't questioning everything. Who show up to the same jobs and the same marriages and the same routines without this gnawing sense of misalignment. And he wonders if they genuinely found their path or if they're just better at not asking the hard questions. Because once you start asking, it's hard to stop. Once you see the gap between the life you have and the life you might want, you can't unsee it. The disorientation of 40 often comes from realizing how much time has passed and how little time feels left. Not in a morbid way, but in a clarifying way. Your 20s felt infinite. Your 30s felt productive. But 40 feels finite. You start doing the math. If you want to change directions, you have maybe 2 decades of prime energy left. maybe less. And that urgency makes every choice feel weightier. Every day spent in misalignment feels more costly. She talks to her therapist about it and struggles to articulate what's wrong. Because nothing is technically wrong. She's healthy. She's employed. She has people who care about her. But something feels off. Like she's living at a frequency that doesn't quite match her internal signal. And the therapist asks the question that cracks it open: if nobody was watching, what would you be doing differently? The answer doesn't come immediately. Because she's spent so long performing the version of herself that gets approval that she's not sure what the unperformed version even looks like. But slowly, in the space of that question, things start surfacing. Small admissions. Quiet truths. The career she stayed in because leaving felt risky. The relationship she maintained because ending it felt like failure. The hobbies she abandoned because they didn't seem serious enough. All the tiny compromises that seemed reasonable at the time but accumulated into a life that doesn't quite fit. He realizes that 40 is forcing him to confront the difference between building a life and living one. His 30s were about building. Establishing. Proving. But the structure he built was designed to impress, not to inhabit. The job title that sounds good at parties but drains him daily. The house that looks impressive but feels empty. The routines that demonstrate responsibility but lack joy. He built it all thinking that once it was complete, he'd feel successful. But 40 showed him that success without alignment is just performance. And here's the painful part. Acknowledging this doesn't automatically fix it. You can't just flip a switch and suddenly want what you have or have what you want. The life you built has momentum. It has obligations. People depend on it. You've invested years into it. Walking away isn't simple. But neither is staying when you know it's not right. So you're stuck in this liminal space, aware of the misalignment but unsure how to realign. She starts small. Not burning everything down, but testing small truths. She takes a class she's curious about instead of one that advances her career. She says no to an obligation she's been fulfilling out of guilt. She spends a Saturday doing something that brings her pleasure rather than productivity. And in those small moments, she catches glimpses of a version of herself that feels more real than the one she's been presenting. He has conversations he's been avoiding. With his partner about whether they're still growing together or just coexisting. With his boss about whether there's room to shift his role toward work that actually interests him. With himself about what he'd do if he knew he wouldn't fail. And those conversations don't solve everything, but they create space. Space to imagine that the life he has doesn't have to be the life he's locked into forever. 40 doesn't have to be a crisis. But it often is a reckoning. A moment when the story you've been telling about your life gets interrupted by the reality of living it. And that interruption can be devastating or liberating, depending on what you do with it. Some people double down on the path they're on, convincing themselves it's fine. Some people blow everything up in a panic. But some people use it as a pivot point. A chance to course correct without catastrophe. She realizes that the question 40 asked isn't was any of it yours. It's can you make it yours now? Can you take the structure you built and inhabit it differently? Can you renegotiate the terms of your life without abandoning it entirely? Can you honor who you've become while making space for who you're still becoming? Because 40 isn't an ending. It's a threshold. And thresholds are where transformation happens. He starts thinking less about what he's supposed to do and more about what feels true. Not impulsively. Not recklessly. But with attention to the quiet voice that's been whispering underneath all the noise. The voice that knows what lights him up and what drains him. The voice that has opinions about how he wants to spend his time and who he wants to spend it with. The voice he's been overriding for years in service of being responsible or successful or acceptable. The truth about 40 hitting different is that it forces you to stop deferring. To stop saying later or someday or when things settle down. Because 40 makes you realize that things don't settle down. That there's no magical future moment when you'll finally have permission to want what you want. That if you're going to align your life with your truth, it has to start now. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But incrementally. Intentionally. With the awareness that you get to choose, even if the choices are complicated. 40 isn't the enemy. The enemy is living a life you don't recognize as your own and pretending that's fine. 40 just happens to be the age when that pretense becomes harder to maintain. When the gap between expectation and reality gets too wide to ignore. When the question of authenticity stops being philosophical and starts being urgent. So yeah. 40 hit different. Not because the number matters, but because the moment matters. Because it's the age when you realize you're not building towards some distant future anymore. You're living in it. And if it doesn't feel right, you have to decide whether to keep performing or start adjusting. Whether to keep following the inherited blueprint or start sketching your own. The choice has always been yours. 40 just makes that choice impossible to avoid.